We're very excited to have Musolff presenting his paper on sources of market power in web search, followed by a discussion of Tobias Klein. This format will be similar to previous editions, which means 45 minutes of presentation for the speaker, around 5 to 10 minutes of discussion, and then a reminder for general Q&A. Feel free to ask questions during the talk. Leon will also stop a couple of times during his talk to give you an opportunity to ask further questions. So I think we're ready to go. So Leon, please go ahead.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Tobias, for kindly agreeing to discuss the paper. I'm excited to tell you about sources of market power in web search. And just to point out, this project is joint work with loads of great people. Any clever ideas are theirs. Any mistakes are mine. Now, I don't think I need to remind anyone in this Zoom meeting, but I still will. Google dominates web search, right? The US desktop web search market share that Google has had for the last decade or so has hovered around 80%, and worldwide Google's dominance is even more obvious. Now, such a high and stably high market share has attracted attention by regulators across the globe. In the US specifically, a judge recently ruled in a landmark antitrust case that Google is a monopolist. And one of the pieces of information that flowed into this decision is the fact that Google seems to be paying on the order of $26 billion a year to become or remain the default search engine on various browsers and phones. So against this backdrop, our paper asks and hopefully attempts to answer two key research questions. The first one is, why is Google's market share so high? It could, of course, be that Google is simply the better search engine. But even if it is the better search engine, one may ask the question, is that only the case because it sees more user data due to its higher market share? It could also be that people simply misperceive the quality of Google's competition, perhaps because they've never tried a DuckDuckGo or Ecosia before. Finally, you might think that with numbers such as $26 billion floating around, default effects, such as switching costs or inattention, could play an outsized role in influencing market outcomes. Now, the second key question we want to ask and answer today is that of the effects of various levers of competition policy. So you might imagine implementing active choice screens like has happened in the European Union, or you could even go stronger and effectively change defaults, for instance, by banning Google from making payments in exchange for the default position, which would effectively lead to its competitors being much more likely to be made the default. And finally, you could think about requiring Google to share data with its competitors. Now, this paper is going to build a model of demand for search engines and then uses that model to carefully craft and design a field experiment that's been designed in such a way that it allows us to address the various sources of market power that our model says might exist. We then combine the results from this field experiment with estimates of economies of scale that we make using Microsoft internal click and query data, and bring all of that together to answer the counterfactuals that were listed under research question 2 above. Now, let me preview the results just in case I don't make it there. We have sort of 3 main experimental results. The first one is that requiring users to make an active choice has little effect. The second one is that users who are paid to use Bing for 2 weeks update positively about it. And, roughly a fifth of them actually keep using Bing after the experiment ends without any payments from us to keep doing so. Finally, switching defaults has a long-term impact on market shares. There does seem to be quite a bit of inattention. Now, the takeaways from these experimental results are that defaults are effective. The combination of inattention and misperceptions means that defaults can act as a good defensive strategy to make sure that your users never learn about other search engines. Choice screens alone, however, do not significantly affect market shares because there is this misperception component where users are worse in their information they have about other search engines. Exposing people to Google's competition for that reason is key to reducing Google's market share. Now, finally, we find that economies of scale and data sharing in this setting, they seem to have quite small effects. And that's partially explained by the fact that Bing the main other search engine that could compete here is already relatively large if you start thinking on a log scale or on a decreasing return scale. And then, of course, there are various limitations of our study that I will get to into more when we get to the conclusions. All right, we're building on standing on the shoulders of giants, as is common in economics. I won't have time to go through all of these papers. Let me just say that there are a set of papers that I've studied, in particular this returns to data question in the past, and we sort of borrow and build on some of their methodology. I think this is like a fascinating topic, how to estimate these returns to scale in data specifically, certainly becoming more and more relevant with the advent of large language models as well. And so I'm excited to sort of be contributing to that literature and these other literatures mentioned here, of course. All right, this is the agenda for today's talk. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the demand model here. And then we're going to go on to experimental design, experimental results and estimation, and returns to data and counterfactuals. So let's start with the demand model. So with my apologies to whoever of you is using some other search engine, we're going to restrict attention to the two main search engines that actually have market share that is sort of not negligible, and that is Google and Bing. And we're going to want to build a model of how consumers choose between these two search engines. And the idea of our model is very simple. Each search engine, J, has some true flow utility that is associated with it, UIJT. And we're just going to decompose that into three terms. The first term is going to be quality. So this covers everything from search result relevance to the number of ads, the quality of the interface, the branding, all of these sorts of things. The second term are going to be payments. And that's important because in real life, the payments are kind of zero, but in our experiment, we will pay users to use different search engines, and that will allow us to estimate, the strength of their preferences as measured in dollar terms. And then finally, we're going to have some idiosyncratic preferences. And the key assumption here that I don't want you to miss is that these idiosyncratic preferences are time invariant over the span of our experiment. Now, our experiment only runs for a couple of months, so I think this is quite a plausible assumption. But because they are time invariant, that allows us to sort of deal with a lot of these issues of selection in a sort of cleaner way. All right, the key idea of our model really is that search engines are experience goods. So in particular, we're going to assume that a user's beliefs about a search engine's quality, they're going to depend on whether that user has experienced the search engine before. So if they have experienced the search engine before, we're going to assume that the users have correct beliefs about the search engine's quality. But if they haven't, we're going to allow their beliefs to be mistaken. Now, crucially, I'm going to say we allow their beliefs to be mistaken. We're going to estimate whether their beliefs are mistaken. So by no means are we assuming that their beliefs are mistaken. We're just sort of allowing this to be the case. So then the perceived flow utility, it's not going to depend on the true quality, but it's going to depend on the perceived quality and the payments. And we will assume that users are unaware that they misperceive quality because otherwise there would be benefits from exploration. And we see essentially no exploratory behavior in our data. So we want to match the data in this particular way. All right, moving on then. There's going to be sort of a default search engine that you come into life with. And the idea is that this default search engine is just determined by your browser. If you're a Chrome user, the default search engine is Google. If you're an Edge user, the default search engine is Bing. We're going to assume that users perceive the quality of their browser-determined default correctly. And that then means there is sort of two sources of inertia in the model. The first one is a switching cost, sigma, that you have to pay to navigate all of those various menus, maybe figure out in the first case which menus you have to navigate to actually change your search engine. And the second one is inattention. Inattention just means if you're inattentive, you're going to stick with your previous choice independently of how the utility difference looks between those two search engines. A fraction phi of users are going to be permanently inattentive. So they're always going to stick with their previous choice. And the remainder are going to vary. Is that a question, Daniel? No, okay. So if you're attentive, you make a choice based on your perceived utility. If you're inattentive, you just stick with your previous search engine. And there is no continuation value in this choice, even though it might feel like a sort of dynamic choice, because you anticipate never switching again, right? You assume that your current belief is the accurate belief about the search engine. All right, so why did I walk you through this demand model? Really to get to this sort of conclusion slide here, which allows us to decompose the steady state market share of Bing amongst Chrome users into the fundamentals in our demand model. So in particular, what this expression here shows you is that there is a couple of reasons why the Google market share can be high. The first one is the true quality. So this difference between the zeta stars. Now, this difference between the zeta stars is going to be contained in this delta zeta tilde to the extent that users have accurate beliefs. So if Google's quality is higher, then Google's market share will be higher. Secondly, though, there might be quality misperceptions. If I use Google, I have the correct perceptions about Google, but I might misperceive the quality of Bing. And if I misperceive the quality of Bing to be a lot lower than it actually is, then that's going to come into this delta zeta tilde term, and that's going to lower my market share up here. Finally, there is 2 additional inertia channels. Switching costs could lower the share of users that are choosing Bing because most users are on Chrome where Google is the default. And similarly, inattention, and in particular permanent inattention, could lower the market share of Bing amongst Chrome users. And it's these 4 channels that we now design an experiment to sort of assess and quantitatively assess how important they are. So with that, let me jump into the experimental design. And after the experimental design, I'm going to stop for a second to see if there are any questions. But of course, also feel free to interrupt me. So the experiment that we ran about a little more than a year ago now was that we recruited around 2,400 people on Prolific, which is a high-quality online survey sample. And these were US adults using a desktop computer. I mean, desktop or laptop doesn't matter. They can be using a laptop, but not on mobile is what I'm saying. And they have to use either Edge or Chrome and either usually search using Google or Bing. So we asked them sort of 2 surveys, the first one immediately on intake, and then another one 14 days later. And the key thing is that we built the search extension that we had them install on the first survey. This extension records every time that a search engine is used. Via your browser history, we can actually record what search engines you were using even before the experiment, which is quite nice for validation. And it also allows us to alter the search result page in certain cases. So let me walk you through the experimental treatment that we sort of implement jointly via the survey and this browser extension. The first one is a simple control treatment. We have a placebo group of users that we show how to change their bookmarks on their browser. Nothing too exciting there. More interesting is our active choice treatment. This group of users we ask for and then have them implement their preferred default search engine. And the way we have them implemented is that we walk them through exactly how to get to that menu where they have to choose the search engine, so this menu down here. And we actually verify that they got to this choice screen by having them copy over this settings page URL. So they can't just say, oh yeah, active choice, but I'm already with my favorite search engine, never mind, right? We really force them to pay the switching cost either way and to be attentive. Now, the third group of users is the switch bonus group. So here the idea is that we're going to offer you some amount of money to switch what search engine you use for 14 days. So if you were using Bing previously, we'd pay you to use Google. If you were using Google previously, we would pay you to use Bing. And then crucially, after 14 days, they need to make an active choice as well. And then finally, we have this default change group, which we offer $10 to change their default just for 2 days. And this is sort of designed to get it in attention. So the overview of our experimental treatments is like this. On day -20, data collection begins because we can use the browser history. On day 0, we have that initial survey and we randomize you into those various treatments. And then on day 14, we have a second survey. Now, for most people, that second survey is a placebo survey. But for everyone in that switch bonus group that we paid money to try out the other search engine, the second survey is an active choice survey because we really want to know their preferences now after they've experienced that search engine, right? You can see how that could get at this learning effect, at this misperception effect. Now, one thing I hadn't mentioned so far is that the $10 switch bonus group is also sub-randomized into a ranking degradation and ad blocking treatment, where our browser extension allows us to sort of give them a slightly modified version of Bing to try and elicit, the determinants of that quality term. And the model, that was just the zeta stars, but the zeta stars we can actually decompose into how much do you care about search result relevance, how much do you hate ads, and so on. All right, let me talk now about identification. And this is really the key figure in this paper. So what I'm going to show you on the horizontal axis is going to be time. On the vertical axis, I'm going to show you the Bing market share amongst Chrome users. Of course, you could equivalently do it for the Google market share amongst Edge users, but the Bing market share amongst Chrome users, and each line is going to be an experimental treatment. So I'm showing you now sort of a stylized representation of how we would expect the data to behave to explain identification. This is not yet data. So we see the control group should be mostly steady. The key thing is the active choice group on day 0 is asked to make an active choice, and hopefully that will affect their market share somehow. However much it affects their market share, the market share under active choice, after an active choice, is going to depend just on the perceived quality difference, not anymore on those inertia terms. And so that's going to give us our read on that perceived quality difference. The difference between active choice and control, of course, must be determined by these inertia terms, so either switching costs or permanent inattention. Now, the nice thing about the switch bonus group is that we're paying them some money, right? So between day 0 and day 14, we're paying them some money to use a different search engine, but they can reject that offer. So in particular, that means that we can measure their price sensitivity by comparing their behavior when they were offered like a positive amount of money to the behavior in the active choice group that was essentially offered a 0 amount of money. Both of these making an active choice without inertia concerns. More interestingly, though, on day 15, the switch bonus group has experienced another active choice survey, right? On day 14, we give them an active choice survey. So on day 15, the market share in the switch bonus group, well, it should really be the same as in the active choice group. The only reason why there would be a difference is that the switch bonus group has had this additional 14 days of experience with the alternative search engine. And so to the extent that there is some learning here, that should be captured by these differences in market shares between the orange line and the light blue line. And then finally, we have this default change group that gets paid money very briefly to very briefly change their search engine. And so from that, we can sort of identify 2 terms. The first one is we get the attention probability sort of period by period from this sort of decaying pattern in the market share. And then secondly, the default change group should eventually asymptote to somewhere like the switch bonus group, because both of these groups will have experienced the alternative search engine. The only reason why there might be a difference here is that the default change group, they don't get that active choice question on day 14, so they might be stuck in this other setting. All right, and there is some subtlety here identifying the difference between switching costs and permanent inattention. The key to seeing that they're separately identified is to notice that the difference between the active choice and the control group is going to be almost unaffected by permanent inattention if people have asymmetric preferences. That is, if people prefer Google over Bing on average. If they care exactly the same amount about Google and Bing, then we're not identified. Then we can't identify these 2 separately. But we were pretty certain that wouldn't be the case. And indeed, we found that it isn't the case. So we are separately identified. And so that difference just tells us about the switching costs. We can also identify the entire distribution of the idiosyncratic preferences, this Xi term from earlier, where often in an I/O paper you would see just a logit assumption. We identify the distribution of this. We can do this because we have switch bonus payments of varying sizes. And so we basically measure the market share at various prices. And if you draw a line through those market shares, that's the demand curve. And so, in other words, we also have some sort of like almost non-parametric identification of these idiosyncratic preferences. I see almost, we measure it at 4 points. We don't measure it at an infinite number of points. But hey, 4 points is better than 1. All right, and with that, we're going to go to experimental results and estimation, but I want to make sure to stop for a second to see if there are any questions. All right, seeing none, please also feel free to interrupt me. I know I can go very fast sometimes. So I will go into the experimental results now. So remember this figure that we looked at a second ago. I am basically now going to implement it in data. And my hope is sort of once I've implemented this in data, really, you know, if lightning strikes and that's the end of the presentation, you probably have already gotten most of the takeaways. We're still going to do counterfactuals and so on, but that's really the key figure. So let me implement this in data. So again, on the horizontal axis, it's just time. I'm just going to measure it in days after survey 1 because users could be recruited into the experiment at slightly varying times. On the vertical axis, I'm going to again show you Bing market share for Chrome users. And each line is going to be one experimental treatment. So we start with a control group. And, you know, you see two things. In the control group, you know, Bing market share is very low. And the other thing is our control treatment didn't really seem to affect the market shares. So that is reassuring. Let's move on to active choice. Now, this slide is not broken. It's just the case that the active choice line lies directly on top of the control line. So what do we learn from this? Well, we learn two things. The first one is there is a small Bing market share in an active choice treatment. So in other words, there's a large perceived quality difference. People really do think, at least, that they prefer Google. Now, the second thing we learn is the market share is the same as in the control treatment. Well, that must mean that there is a small switching cost, right? Because otherwise, if there was a large switching cost, then when I woke you up and sort of forced you to pay that switching cost, you would have said, oh, now that I have to pay the switching cost anyhow, I might as well go with my true preference here, which is Bing. So that doesn't happen, so small switching costs. So now let's talk about the switch bonus group. And let's first look at that incentive period, the first 14 days, right? Good news for economists everywhere. When you pay people to do something, they do it, right? So in other words, demand slopes down. Users are price sensitive. But of course, the more interesting question is what happens on day 15, sort of after this incentive period ends, when they are not anymore paid to use Bing, and they have made another active choice, knowing that they won't be paid to use Bing. And what happens is, okay, the market share goes down, of course. You would expect that. We're now paying them $0 instead of $5 or $10. But the Bing share actually stays significantly above the market share in the active choice treatment. So in other words, this suggests that users update positively about Bing. They either learn how to use Bing or they learn about Bing's quality. And to be clear, these two explanations we can't really distinguish here, but these two explanations would give you this pattern where Bing's market share stays elevated. A little more on that in a second. Before that, I just want to briefly...
Leon,
yes, Sandro.
Can I interrupt you?
Please.
Since nobody else does. So what you just said, that you cannot distinguish whether they learn how to use Bing or they come to realize that it's not as bad as they thought it was. This learning part, isn't it almost the same as switching cost? And why is it that you can exclude switching cost and this learning is not something that you can exclude? Yeah. That is a switching cost. Or you can distinguish, actually. I don't know. It's one or the other.
No, that's a great question. So I think the difference is that learning here, we assume that you don't anticipate it happening. Whereas the switching cost, you know, oh, I could switch to Bing. I would have to pay the switching cost. But learning is something that's like unexpected. You're like, you just dislike Bing, and then you try Bing for 2 weeks because you have to, / someone is paying you to do it. And you're like, oh, wait, like actually Bing is not so bad. And it could be that Bing is not so bad because you learned how to use it, or it could be that Bing just wasn't that bad and you learned about its quality. Does that help?
Could you say that at this stage, the switching cost is sunk, switching cost being the learning cost? Is that an explanation you would accept?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of two ways to play. Like we can call the learning thing another switching cost. That's fine. That's semantics, I think. But the important thing is that it's not anticipated. Okay, and that's in my head, that's more natural for learning than it is for switching costs. But we could discuss that. But that's the not anticipating the cost. That's the important thing for our model. Perfect. All right, so what we see in this default change treatment very nicely is we have this beautiful decaying pattern. So the market share goes down. This is some people are attentive and they sort of, stochastically become attentive with relatively high probability, relatively quickly. But then the market share asymptotes at a pretty high level. And that suggests to us that there is a difference still between the orange and the dark blue line, suggests there might be permanent inattention here. All right, let me talk more about this orange line, right? That's, I think, the most interesting result here. Why is the orange line staying high? And this is really about learning in the switch bonus group. So let me give you some alternative perspectives on this. The first thing we did is we measured the relative preference for Bing before and after the switch. So before the switch, everyone agrees Google is a lot better on these 3 dimensions here: relevant ads, relevant links, overall quality. After the switch, they still think that, but they think that less, right? And statistically significantly less. So in other words, exposing them to Bing made them update positively about Bing if you believe their stated preferences, not just if you believe their revealed preferences. I can put an even finer point on it because we surveyed them sort of open-endedly, the stayers, and we asked them, hey, why did you stay with Bing? Like, we weren't paying you anymore. What gives? And they say things like, I have learned I overall enjoy Bing more. I found that I like the results I'm getting in Bing. And my personal favorite, because it kind of summarizes the paper, I realized Bing was not as bad as I thought it was. All right, I realized Bing was not as bad as I thought it was. And we can put numbers on that as well if we want, and we get sort of the same results. We get some support for this idea that they might also be learning how to use Bing. And to the extent that you think that might have different wealth results, I just wanted to flag that. Yes,
Leon, surely that last quote, I realized, has to be the title of your final version of the paper.
I definitely agree with you that it is a very good representation of the paper's results. Yes, Adrian.
Just one question. Here, I'm not really sure how relevant the mean values are. Don't you have the data from asking them before and then after, right?
Yes.
So there must be some switches and some people who stay at their judgment of overall quality, for example, and some who now think that Bing is better because they stay, right? Because if I think, okay, Bing is better than I expected, but I still think Google is better, then I shouldn't switch, right?
I mean, I agree with that, although it might, of course, be that they don't, like, this never works out quite as nicely with stated preferences and revealed preferences aligning perfectly, right? It's not the case that if you ask people, like, give a number rating Google and a number rating Bing, and then you check which is the higher number, that's always the choice they make. But I agree, we could zoom in onto the stayers and look at that in a bit more detail. That's a good idea. Thank you, Adrian. All right, so we've talked about learning now. Let me talk also briefly about the strength of the sort of dislike of Bing, I guess, or the strength of the attachment to Google. So one thing we can do is we can look at the price response. At different prices, there are different market shares for Bing. If we don't pay anything, Bing's market share in our sample is around 2%. And if we pay $25, Bing's market share is around 75%. An interesting thing is that, like, this is still not 100%, and these are prices for 2 weeks, right? So it's $25 every 2 weeks. That is $600 a year. That's quite a lot of money. So there are some people who have very strong preferences for Google over Bing. On the other hand, if you just pay $1, that's just $24 a year. You already get a third of people. So some people have very weak preferences as well. And so that is why we thought it was so important to have this sort of idiosyncratic preferences follow a bespoke distribution so that we could capture the sort of long tail. The Logit would not be able to capture it. And the bespoke distribution we use, you can see here, it's essentially like a parameterized log normal distribution, but it allows us to fit all of these data points very well. And so have that sort of one-sided long tail in the preferences. All right, we can also talk about what happens to the edge users, right? These are users who are defaulted into Bing. And what we see is that under active choice, their Google market share goes up a little bit. And under a switch bonus, their Google market share goes up a lot when we pay them, and then it comes back down to the active choice level afterwards. So in other words, there doesn't seem to be much learning from people who were defaulted into Bing about Google. And we think that's quite reasonable because most people then use Google, at least on their mobile device or maybe on their work device. Google's market share is so high, it's really hard to find people who have really never experienced Google before, even if they don't experience it on this device where the experiment is running. All right, let me tell you about one more thing our extension can do. So our extension can re-rank search results on Bing. So in particular, if you search for my colleagues' personal webpage, Juan Pablo et al., you get this as the top result on Bing. Bing is not that bad. You can find this easily enough. But if you are in our treatment group, you're going to find some other pages right at the top here, because what we have done is we have reversed the search result order within page, right? This is extremely frustrating, I can tell you, because I was dogfooding this extension and forgot about it when inviting seminar speakers for our seminar last year. And boy, I got mad at some of you. I was like, why do you not have a personal web page? How hard can it be to find your papers? And it turned out I just had the extension on. So it happens very smoothly in the background. You won't notice, and yet it will really degrade the search result experience on Bing. So we had this on for some of these people in this S10cc switch group. These are people who were using Google at baseline, who were switched into Bing for those 14 days. So let's see what the results from this treatment were. Well, the first thing is the click-through rate went down a lot, right? So the click-through rate is sort of an industry standard measure of how good the search result relevance is. And on Bing in our sample, it was something like 35% on average. And when we had the ranking degradation treatment active, that went down by 8 percentage points, which is, quite a large fraction of those 35%. Now, what happened to the relevance rating? Here, we're kind of doing a diff and diff. We can compare before and after for the people who, the people who got the ranking degradation treatment and experienced Bing, and the people who didn't get the ranking degradation treatment and experienced Bing. So people who didn't get ranking degradation, they actually updated positively about Bing's quality as according to their stated preferences. They said, oh, this is better than I thought. But the people who got the ranking degradation treatment, they thought it was about what they expected, slightly worse than they expected, but kind of what they expected. So I thought that was quite interesting. Then finally, however, we also look at the market share sort of after that active choice that follows the switching treatment. And what we see there is that, yes, Bing's market share is lower for the people exposed to ranking degradation, but it's not a lot lower. So there doesn't seem to be a huge effect of this. Maybe people don't care about search result relevance that much. We were surprised by these results, and to be clear, they are not statistically significant, but also the standard error is relatively large. So it's consistent with a weak but positive quality response, as well as with a zero quality response. My prior would rule out a zero quality response, but you can think about what your prior is here. All right, putting it all together, this is where in an I/O paper, usually I have the slide that goes through estimation and, my likelihood function and whatnot. Turns out this is relatively easy in this paper because I showed you earlier that identification is all about, the difference between two market shares. Well, what we're going to do is we just do GMM with all the underlying market shares, right? And so you immediately see how it's identified, and you can see how we can get those market shares as moments out of the model very easily. And then we estimate the parameters over here. Rather than go through each parameter one by one, let me just focus on a couple of key ones. The first one is permanent inattention. We find that about a third of users are permanently inattentive. So they are just not reacting to quality differences between Google and Bing. Initially, I thought that was a very large number, but if you read the court documents in this DOJ versus Google case, there is users who are not even aware that like a search engine is like a thing they can choose, or like that this isn't part of the browser or maybe even the operating system. So maybe this is not so crazy after all. Secondly, what's the strength of the perceived Bing preference? Well, if users make an active choice, a Bing payment of $3.20 every 2 weeks would equalize market shares. Now notice that this is a lot less than the sort of $25 I was talking about earlier. And that's because of that long tail. Some people have very strong preferences in favor of Google, but that's not most people. You can already get most people with a very small payment. Now that payment would shrink even more if we were to correct misperceptions. However, it only shrinks by 21 cents. So it shrinks, yes, but also still it's true that on average, people, even when they've had a chance to experience the competition, do prefer Google, and they would have to be compensated to choose some other search engine. All right, with that, let's switch gears a little, and let's talk about returns to data. And given the timing, I might just take the second set of questions, unless you have a great one, in which case interrupt me, please, immediately. But otherwise, I will take the second set of questions sort of at the end to make sure I get through the rest of the talk. So let me talk about returns to data. And this is where we now switch gears from the experimental results, and instead we have to use observational data, right? Unless you have amazing contacts and are very clever like Tobias, you can't actually convince search engines to run experiments on their production traffic. I'm very amazed that Tobias was able to do this, but we alas, were not. So we have to use observational data to get at this returns to data part. And so the basic idea here is that, more users means you have more data, which might mean you get better search results because you can train your ranking algorithm more, which might attract more users, and then this sort of becomes a flywheel. And we've already talked about whether better search results really attract more users, right? The answer was a bit more nuanced than we expected. It seemed to be a weaker effect, certainly, but maybe we were also a little bit underpowered to measure this. Now, as an aside, by the way, this entire study was powered to measure this effect. It just turns out that the effect is quite weak and it's extremely expensive to power to measure this. But the key question I want to ask now is, does additional data actually translate into better search results? Because we still have to, think about this arrow as well. And so what we do to work this out is we use Microsoft internal click and query data, so this is observational data, to estimate the effect of the number of searches on the click-through rate. We sort of use the click-through rate as our measure of the quality of search results, and then translate click-through rate units into market share units using this experiment I showed you earlier. Basically, that experiment tells you how much people disliked our ranking degradation treatment. Our ranking degradation treatment had a certain effect on click-through rates. That tells you how much people dislike quality and click-through rates under some functional form assumption. What we're going to do here is we're going to exploit within query variation for new queries. So the idea is the following. We can find a bunch of event studies as like the following. Follow a query over time, a new query, as it accumulates searches, and look at its click-through rate. And in particular, look at its click-through rate around the time that Bing changes how it's ranking the top result, right? Just focus on the click-through rate for the top result. At some point, Bing is going to have accumulated enough evidence to realize, Tobias should be on top for search paper query rather than Leon. And so it's going to switch in Tobias. And when it does that, we're going to call that the event, because that is when it got additional data that could have changed, the click-through rate of the top result. And so we want to look at an event study around this event and see how the click-through rate changes when Bing changes its mind about who to rank at the top. And then as these events accumulate over time, the click-through rate increases and increases and increases. So we get a bunch of event studies like the one on the right-hand side. And the caveat here is that we need to extrapolate from just these new queries, because if you look at old queries, it's just there is too much information already. We might not be able to keep track of how much information Bing already has and so on. So at the end of the day, what our conclusion from this is that if Bing had access to Google's data, the click-through rate would increase from 23.5% to 24.8%. Definite positive effect. Is it a large effect? I don't know. That's hard to know in click-through rate units, right? 1.3 is certainly less than the sort of massive ranking degradation effect we saw earlier from reversing the search result order. But reversing the search result order is a very strong intervention as well. And the other thing I want to say that I didn't have space to put on the slide is we have like a very concrete model of how additional data relates to click-through rate. And it very much does not assume constant returns to scale or decreasing returns to scale. It's flexible on that dimension. And we find that it's logarithmic. It's exactly logarithmic. All right. Now let me put it all together and talk about counterfactuals. So we're going to do some counterfactuals here. And for each one, I'm going to show you both Google's market share and the consumer surplus gain in dollars per year. This is kind of a weird market because when you talk to the regulators, they almost only care about this first number here, right? They really want Google's market share to go down. And I get it. Google's market share is extremely high. That's extremely like, as a descriptive stat, that's just extremely worrying. But as economists, we have to also ask the question, if this policy reduces Google's market share, does it do it in a way that actually helps consumers? And so that's why we have the consumer surplus here as well. All right. In the status quo, Google's market share is about 89%. And what happens if we eliminate all frictions? Well, if we eliminate all frictions, Google's market share drops by something like 12, 13%, right? So that's actually sounds like not that large a change, but if you think, Bing's market share is sort of the 100% minus this more than doubles Bing's market share. So this would be a massive, massive thing for Bing if we could somehow eliminate all frictions. But eliminating all frictions, of course, is quite hard for the regulators to do. So what could the regulators actually do? Well, one thing they could do is they could implement a choice screen, like in the European Union. Say on Chrome, you have to, the first time you open the browser, you have to actively choose, do you want to use Bing or Google? That's going to eliminate the switching costs here. And what we're going to have is that Google's market share is going to go down, but only by about 1.3 percentage points. So this result, we quite like this result in the following sense. There's a Francesco De Carolis and there's a paper that analyzes what actually happened in the European Union, and they find about this size effect in the European Union. So that's great. But on the other hand, this is no good policy, right? This is like barely going to move things. So what could you do? Well, what would be really great is if you could somehow correct the misperceptions. And if you did that, you would already get most of the way there, right? You would get already to 80% Google market share. But how are you going to correct the misperceptions? That's kind of like not usually the way a regulator thinks. Well, the way a regulator thinks is what we could do is we could outlaw Google's payments to be the default, and then it would be a Bing default everywhere, most likely. But with a Bing default everywhere, that's really bad, right? Google's market share craters, but also there is a massive consumer surplus loss because people dislike Bing, but they're inattentive. So they're going to be stuck with it if you default them into it. So here's our proposal. What if you made Bing the default, but then you had a delayed choice screen 2 weeks later? If you did that, you would reduce Google's market share, but you basically avoid this consumer surplus loss that you would have from just the normal Bing default. And that's because you're rescuing people. You're rescuing all of these inattentive people who would have been stuck with Bing. After 2 weeks, they've already experienced Bing now, so they have corrected their misperceptions, but also they haven't been stuck with Bing for the entire year. So that's sort of the key takeaway in the paper. Now, one more thing, which is that all of this was for fixed quality. So I haven't yet endogenized these returns to scale factor that I estimated in the second part of the paper. Now, why did I do that? Well, the reason is that if I do endogenize this quality, we can go through all of these counterfactuals again, but basically none of the results change. And that's because we estimated a pretty small demand response to result relevance, right? That was when I said maybe we have a large standard error, but either way, the effect is reasonably small. And we have a small effect of data on result relevance. By the way, I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but that effect of data on result relevance is extremely precisely estimated. So this is not another small, large standard error situation. This is a really small standard errors and really precisely estimated. The returns to data in terms of result relevance are strictly positive, but they are logarithmic. And because they're logarithmic, that means going from Bing size to Google size, it's just not that huge a change. For an entrant going from 0 to Bing size, that would be a massive change. And our model would predict that here data sharing would really matter. Now, one thing, that's actually a good point. I hadn't yet mentioned the data sharing counterfactual. Data sharing doesn't affect things here a lot. One more thing to point out is that because that demand response to result relevance was kind of imprecisely estimated, we wanted to check what if we were just really unlucky? What if it's at the 95th percentile of that estimate, right? And we see that even at the 95% CI boundary of our estimate of demand response to result quality, data sharing barely moves the needle, right? It has like a 0.5 percentage points additional effect relative to frictions. All right, I think with that, I'm basically at time, so let me conclude. What are the takeaways? Defaults are an effective tool for Google, mostly a defensive tool rather than an offensive tool. And that's because a third of users are permanently inattentive, and defaults that can prevent permanently inattentive users from learning about other search engines. So it sort of prevents the situation where your users learn that the competition actually is good and then start using it. How can regulators reduce Google's market share? Well, choice screens alone won't move the needle. Changing the default does, but comes with a large decrease in consumer surplus. And temporarily switching the default and having a delayed choice screen, that might work. But that is, of course, a much more complicated solution. Economies of scale and data sharing seem to have small effects. And just a couple of caveats. Of course, we use sort of desktop users, so not mobile users, and the sample may not be representative. And then this economies of scale analysis was observational, so it's not as, externally valid, possibly suffers from other threats to identification as the experimental results. And with that, let me say thank you so much and hand it over to Tobias.
Okay, thanks, Leon, for this great talk. We'll move to Tobias next for the discussion of the paper.
Yes. Thanks for asking me to discuss this paper. To preface what I'm going to say, let me just say that this paper is extremely well done. So it's very hard to find small details that could have done better. So what I'll do is I'll provide a bit of context from my perspective, having worked on this myself. And then I'm going to take 5 steps back and talk about the paper, how I see it from a distance. Context is, why does Google have such a big market share? What can we do about it? And should we do something about it if we were to speculate a bit? And of course, the paper does not attempt to answer all these questions. It attempts to contribute to the debate by measuring something very well. And in particular, what the paper is doing, it tries to quantify, it does quantify the effects of frictions. It quantifies the effects of inattention, switching costs, and quality misperceptions in quite a clever way by conducting an experiment and looking at what users do, combining this with a nice model that makes a lot of sense in this context. The bottom line is, the bottom line finding is that without frictions, at least to me, Bing's market share increases from 11 to 24%. That tells us that these frictions matter, and the conclusions in the paper are nuanced. But it also depresses me a little bit because that increase is not higher, given what we know about Bing's quality. So it does, the paper does ultimately rationalize the large market share of Google with a pronounced preference for Google. So it says there's a fat tail of users that strongly prefer Google. Now, you mentioned this paper here, and this is also a paper I immediately had to think about. The findings are indeed very much in line with what the authors found here. So this paper analyzes this intervention in Europe, where people had to choose a default search engine. And what they find is that most people choose Google. Okay, and of course, that's not the end of the story. And of course, what you do is valuable because you explain that this is to a large extent also driven by quality misperceptions. So you can quantify that effect. And I think that's a very nice addition to what this paper here found. Related to what we've been doing, you have been very kindly mentioning this. So I just wanted to share this for context. So instead of looking at click-through rates and inferring quality from that, what we have done in our paper is to actually have humans look at search results and rate them, right? And we did that in a very systematic way. We just have to look at Bing and Google for the purpose here, What we do find is that Bing's results, by and large, are in the ballpark range for Google, but they're not quite there yet. And then we split this up by popularity of the query. So the popularity of the query tells us how much data users have produced in the past searching for something like this. And what we did find was that this is driven by queries that are not searched so often, right? By search terms that don't appear so often. At the same time, and this is something we found interesting, for popular queries, and as you also said, Bing does very well. And it tells us that to some extent, at least for these popular queries, Bing is able to have an algorithm that works, right? And that gives us some confidence that in principle, Bing could also make it work even better for these queries, but there's still some, to some extent, unexplained difference between Bing and Google results. And then we also trace out in our paper these network effects, these data, the dependence of search result quality on the amount of data. And we see that for the purpose of this paper here, it actually doesn't matter, because here at the margin, so you get these concave functions out of this, but at the margin, it will not matter. It does matter for entrants, like small search engines, whether they have data. But here for this paper, I would have also expected this not to matter too much. Finally, and this was a preface to what we did in our paper, we never published this. We also measured what people care about. And we did find, and this leads a bit to my 5 steps that I want to go back, people do care about search result quality. More than they care about the number of ads and the degree of personalization or privacy infringement. And what you see here always is relative to the best. So the first result is what they're looking for. How much less do they like a search engine when the result they're looking for is between the 4th and the 10th result, let's say. So we see here that quality matters to people. And we did this in a discrete choice experiment with a conjoint analysis, so there are no frictions by design. So that is a bit of a difference between what you find and what we found, leading up to my comments. Now, the first comment, the first big comment would be the role of search result quality. The paper finds that Google's large market share is only to a relatively small extent driven by inattentional switching costs or quality misperceptions. And the main explanation of the large market share, as I said, is that pronounced preference for Google for a large group of people. So I spent a long time trying to understand why that comes out of the experiment, because I would have thought that maybe people care about quality, and you don't find that, right? So maybe there's a technical reason for that, but I'm not sure. So what you do is you measure the effect of marginal differences in result relevance by changing the order of Bing's inferior results for 2 weeks. And by doing this reversal of the ranking of the results. And you find that the effects of this are small, right? Users don't seem to react to that. And to me, this is still a big mystery why that is. So I would have expected that they react more to this. And in some sense, this is the driving force, I think, behind your finding that it must be a preference for Google rather than the quality that matters here. And technically, when estimating the structural model, what you're essentially doing is some sort of an extrapolation exercise from this, and therefore you find what you find. I can't put my finger on it, why people don't react. I don't know. I don't think there's anything wrong, but it is a finding that is partly at odds with what we found in our discrete choice experiment. But the discrete choice experiment is just the typical thing you would do in an exploratory phase, and I don't know what drives it. So now my 5 steps back. I think it might be worth investigating further why there is actually such a fat tail of users that strongly prefer Google, given what I just said. Maybe users do care more about the quality than the paper finds. That would be the technical thing and sort of what happens in the experiment. maybe there's another type of switching costs that we are overlooking here. Maybe there's some very long learning process that ultimately leads to people liking Bing, and until then somehow they don't. And maybe users also are experiencing some sort of lock-in, or there's some effects coming from Google basically supplying a whole ecosystem of services, and people don't want to have too many suppliers of services. In any case, Google's large market share still, at least to me, is a cause of concern. It baffles me that Nadella claims that Microsoft has invested 100 billion to get Bing to where it is, and yet the market share is something like 10 or 20% only. So that's an immensely large entry cost, and generally more competition in the search market could lead to more innovation. Lower advertising prices when we think of this through the lens of multi-sided markets models, and maybe also better search result quality if there's more innovation, and if there is these network effects where data leads to better search results. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Tobias. Leon, would you like to respond to Tobias first?
Yeah, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was a really great discussion. I totally agree with you that we were very surprised that users reacted so little to the quality changes. Maybe just a couple of pieces of information for context, or to re-emphasize. I don't think it's a marginal change to Bing's quality. It was literally taking the least, the lowest ranked result and putting it at the top, and the second, and the second to last. So like it is a pretty brutal change to Bing's quality. In fact, before we did the experiment, we had internal discussions whether this was too strong and people would notice. But from what we can tell, nobody noticed. We did debriefs and stuff. So I do think it was a strong intervention. Another thing to note is the market, the mean estimate of that effect of quality is small. But if we go to that 95 CI boundary, we are actually at something like a 50% effect on market share. And we have share, and it doesn't change our conclusions. So I do take your point that this is an important part in the model estimates, but also robust to like changing it at least in ways that statistical uncertainty would give us, and that reaches up to relatively large responses. So I think most of those data sharing effects, for instance, like you correctly emphasized, are driven by the fact that like Bing is just already quite large. But thank you so much, and I would love to have those slides if you don't mind sending them. Yes, Heiner, or yeah, Matthias.
Heiner, go ahead. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. So Heiner.
Hi, thanks, great talk. Could it be that many people just don't like Bing because it's a Microsoft product, and many people don't like Microsoft? So if Bing were coming from a different company that has better reputation, then these results would change here. Also, a lot of people get a lot of utility out of Google products like Google Maps without ever paying. So a lot of people may perceive Google as the good guys and Microsoft as the bad guys, which could drive these results.
I definitely agree that it could be that people just dislike Microsoft for some reason, or equivalently like Google for some reason, right? In fact, in some sense, that's what we find. There is sort of like, I would think of it as a brand effect, or like some unexplained preference for one over the other. For those sort of ecosystem effects, Tobias also brought them up. I agree there is some ecosystem effects on Google's side. There's also quite a lot on Bing's side. So Bing actually sometimes can like search through your files and integrate that into the search results if you're like in a Microsoft ecosystem, which a lot of people are. So it's not clear to me in what direction that would influence results. But yeah, it's a good point. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah, Adrian, go ahead.
So maybe this goes beyond the scope of this, but this browser extension that you implemented, it seems rather invasive. And how did you get that through the board of ethical approval thingy at your institution?
Yeah, it's probably a little less invasive than you're thinking right now because I skipped over some of the details. So it looks at your browser history, but it only looks at your browser history to determine when you visited google.com. It doesn't even like extract the queries. It extracts the query, like it extracts just enough information about the queries so that we can deduplicate them. But like we can't tell what you searched for instance, or anything like that. So the IRB actually was completely fine with the extension. We didn't even have to do like a second round review or something like that, because it's really minimal on that front. Yeah.
Any other questions? So I have one. So how do you think AI will be affecting all of this? I mean, these experiments were done before, I'm assuming before Google and Bing were showing their AI results as well. And consumers may perceive Microsoft to be better at doing AI than Google. I don't know, but could be the case. So do you think that could have like effects?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we actually did ask about AI integration, chatbot integration as part of our rating questions. And at the time of our experiment, Google hadn't integrated it, and Microsoft was just starting to. And consistent with that, that's the one dimension on which we find people prefer Bing AI rating, or sorry, AI integration. And yet it didn't seem to affect them, right? So I don't think that it's going to change the market so much just from the fact that some company is going to integrate it better than the other. I mean, what we've seen since then is both companies are sort of like fast following and copying each other's features. I think there's an interesting question here whether, AI as a market is also a contested market. And it could be that Google will sort of, win that contested market mostly because it has so much ways to interact with users where it can sort of default the user into Gemini. So we see Google Chrome now has like Gemini integration, and Google Search, of course, does. And so that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I do think it goes sort of beyond this paper, but it'd be super interesting to study what will happen in this LLM market. And of course, you have different or similar sort of data feedback effects also going on there.
Okay, thanks. I think we're out of time. So thanks everyone for attending, and thanks Leon and Tobias for their presentation and discussion. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks at the next CEPR Virtual I/O seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.